A girl came home from school and was alone for just a few minutes. When her parents returned, she had mysteriously disappeared. The police searched for weeks, but it was like she had disappeared without a trace. Then, out of the blue, a development in the case sparked a chain of events that captured the nation's attention. This incident became one of the most infamous and shocking cases in Canadian history, leaving a lasting impact that still resonates today. Queensville was known as a safe town where everyone knew one another. Christine lived there with her parents and her older brother, who was 5 years her senior. She loved spending time outdoors, riding her bike and playing baseball, a sport she picked up from her brother. Christine also had a big heart for animals. One day, a little bat flew into her home. While her family was terrified, Christine was thrilled and wanted to keep it as a pet. On October 3rd, 1984, 9-year-old Christine woke up early, ready for another school day. Her brother had a dental appointment, so their mum was taking him to the dentist. After school, Christine was expected to stay home alone until her parents returned. Though she was still young, her parents trusted her independence, having left her alone before. Before heading off to school, Christine made plans to meet her best friend once they both got home. Christine boarded the bus that took her just a few hundred meters from her home. Once she arrived at the park where she and her friend had planned to meet, she started to wait. However, as time went by and her friend still hadn't arrived, Christine decided to head back home. She tried calling her friend, but there was no answer. Meanwhile, Christine's mum and brother returned home, and the mother immediately sensed something was wrong. Her daughter was missing. It was evident that Christine had come home after school. Her backpack was still in her room, and the mail was left in the hallway. However, some strange details began to stand out. First, Christine's bike lay on the ground in front of their house, its front wheel bent. Christine loved that bike and rode it whenever she could, so it seemed unusual that she would just leave it there. Secondly, her belt was hanging on the top hook in the hallway, an area clearly out of her reach. At first, Christine's mum didn't see any cause for alarm. She assumed her daughter might have gone for a walk, as she often did, and began waiting for her return. However, as darkness settled over the street, her worry grew. Even though Christine was independent and loved being outdoors, she always returned home and kept her mom informed of her plans. The longer she stayed gone, the more anxious the mother became. Feeling a surge of panic, Christine's mom began calling all her daughter's friends, hoping one of them might have seen her. But each call returned the same unsettling answer. No one had seen Christine since school. The growing realization that something might be seriously wrong deepened her anxiety. When she finally reached Christine's best friend, she learned that they had planned to meet at the park, but Christine never showed up. With the realization that none of her daughter's friends had seen her, the mother enlisted her son to help search for Christine. Given the small size of their town, they quickly checked all the places Christine loved to hang out, but there was still no trace of her. As darkness fell around 7 p.m., the mother made the heart-wrenching decision to call the police. For the local police, cases like this were usually routine. They often encountered kids who wandered off or ran away in a moment of frustration, and these children were typically found quickly, often without the need for a full investigation. This time, however, the police organized a search and rallied local residents to join in the effort to find Christine. As the investigation progressed, they uncovered that Christine had stopped by a small shop situated between her home and the park, where she was supposed to meet her friend. She had bought a pack of chewing gum, but what happened after that remained a complete mystery. Unfortunately, the shop lacked surveillance cameras, which made it difficult for officers to piece together a clear timeline of events. They suspected that Christine had visited the store just a few minutes after arriving home from school. The search stretched into the night, but there was still no trace of Christine. The following day, even more people joined the effort, and the police began to receive numerous tips from the community. Unfortunately, none of the tips turned out to be helpful. While many claimed to have seen a girl on the street or in a car, none could confirm it was Christine, and they struggled to recall specific details. As the days passed, the police began to entertain the possibility of foul play. In such a close-knit community, it seemed improbable that Christine could have vanished without a trace. Her mother was adamant that her daughter would never run away from home. Despite their growing concerns, the police struggled to find any leads that could help them uncover Christine's whereabouts. They conducted a search of her home, but their inexperience led to a poorly executed investigation. The officers only did a cursory examination of Christine's belongings, failing to collect fingerprints or other crucial evidence. To complicate matters further, friends and family had already visited the house prior to the police inspection, potentially compromising any evidence that might have been left behind. It's important to mention that at the time of Christine's disappearance, her father was in jail, having been sentenced to a short term for minor fraud just weeks earlier. On the day Christine went missing, her mother and brother had visited him after a dental appointment. Once it became apparent that Christine was likely kidnapped, her father was released from jail to be with his family and quickly joined the search for his daughter. The search efforts stretched on for several weeks, but neither Christine nor any clues about her disappearance were found. The search area gradually expanded, encompassing numerous fields and forests around the town, yet no leads surfaced. This continued for 3 months, leading up to December 31st. While everyone was getting ready to celebrate the new year, Christine remained missing. Although some held on to the hope that she might still be found alive, many others were starting to lose faith. On that day, a man from a nearby town, Sunderland, about 56 kilometers from Queensville, set out to look for his missing dog. While walking through the forest near his home, he noticed what looked like a small pile of trash. As he got closer, he was horrified to realize it was a human body. Rushing home, he called the police. When the officers arrived, they quickly located the deceased individual despite the significant decomposition. Beside the body lay a small tape recorder with a piece of paper that read Christine Jessup. This tape recorder had been distributed to students at her school on the very day she disappeared. The officers quickly suspected foul play. Alongside Christine's body, they found parts of her clothing, her pants and underwear, while her upper garments remained intact. The body was sent to a medical examiner, prompting the police in Queensville to reclassify the case as a murder. Investigators noted multiple lacerations on Christine's body, which were determined to be the cause of death, along with signs of sexual assault. They also discovered foreign biological material on the waistband of her underwear. However, at that time, DNA analysis wasn't feasible, so this crucial evidence couldn't help identify the perpetrator. Sources indicated that the victim was murdered elsewhere and then transported to the location where her body was eventually found. It seemed the killer had traveled about 60 kilometers, leaving her remains near another city, as the area around Queensville was predominantly made up of expansive fields and forests. Investigators speculated that the perpetrator might have had a connection to Sunderland and selected this spot because of his familiarity with it. Investigators were fairly convinced that the perpetrator lived in Queensville and likely knew Christine, as all evidence indicated she may have gone with him or willingly entered his vehicle. When asked if Christine had ever mentioned anyone she considered a potential suspect, her family could not recall any individuals who seemed suspicious. The police interviewed nearly all residents of the town, zeroing in on several individuals with criminal records or prior offences. Despite their thorough efforts, they were unable to find any connections between these individuals and Christine's case. This situation continued until February, when detectives returned to speak with Christine's mother again. They urged her to think carefully about anyone in the neighborhood who might have seemed suspicious. This time, she remembered something unusual. Next to them lived the Morin family, who were well respected in the community. The head of the family ran a small business and was known for his willingness to help with various tasks. Because of this, many residents of Queensville often sought his assistance, and he had built good relationships with numerous people in the area. He had 6 adult children who worked alongside him in the family business. One of them, 25-year-old Paul Morin, still lived at home with his parents. Christine's mother recalled some odd behavior from Paul. First, after her daughter went missing, he did not participate in the search efforts, unlike most other residents of the town. Second, after Christine's body was found, Paul chose not to attend her funeral, which was attended by hundreds of mourners. The woman mentioned that Paul was quite reserved and tended to isolate himself. He had a few friends and a girlfriend, but aside from his immediate family, he mostly kept to himself. Paul also played the clarinet, which caught the detectives' attention, especially since Christine had received a tape recorder the day she disappeared. They speculated that Paul might have used his musical talent to attract her attention and lure her in. Given that Paul lived just a few meters away from their house, the detectives decided to question him. When they inquired about his relationship with Christine, Paul insisted they had never spoken, except for one instance when he had helped her catch a dog that was chasing her. When the detectives asked Paul about his activities on the day Christine disappeared, he claimed he had been at work, located about 57 kilometers away. He recounted that after finishing his shift, he stopped at a store to buy groceries, visited a gas station, and got home around 5 p.m. Finally, the detectives probed into his thoughts about Christine, curious about his perspective on the situation. When asked about Christine, Paul described her as a normal, nice child, but added a peculiar comment, "But sometimes they grow up ruined." This unsettling remark raised red flags for the detectives, leading them to dig deeper into his alibi. They obtained a time card from Paul's workplace, revealing he had finished his shift at 3:32 p.m. This timeline suggested that even if he had hurried directly to Christine's house, he wouldn't have arrived before her mother got home. Further investigation confirmed that he had indeed stopped at a store and a gas station, which took about half an hour. His friends supported his claim that he got home around 5 p.m. and immediately fell asleep, citing exhaustion from work. Based on the timeline, investigators determined that Paul likely didn't have enough time to abduct Christine on his own. However, they suspected that his relatives might have played a role in his return or were potentially covering for him. The detectives sought permission to search the car Paul drove, and in the trunk they found several fabric fibers. Forensic analysis later confirmed that these fibers matched the material of the sweater Christine had been wearing on the day she went missing. Investigators also discovered various hair samples at the crime scene, which experts suggested could belong to the victim, although there was no definitive confirmation. At that time, specialists could only perform visual comparisons of hair samples, identifying similarities or clear differences in color. Eventually, the police consulted an FBI profiler experienced in similar cases. After reviewing the evidence, the profiler suggested that the suspect was likely a man from Queensville, aged between 19 and 26, with a history of violent crimes or murder. The profiler outlined specific characteristics that might help narrow down the search for the potential offender. Despite the profile, detectives began focusing on individuals who matched the physical description, even if they didn't have a criminal background. In Paul's case, he had no prior offenses or negative reputation, which led some investigators to view him as a less likely suspect. However, the police remained convinced of his guilt. On April 22nd, they decided to arrest him, but Paul steadfastly denied any involvement in the crime. He was incarcerated while awaiting his trial, leaving Christine's mother in shock at the thought that such a horrific crime could have been committed by someone so close, her neighbor. However, a major hurdle for the detectives was the mother's firm belief about the timeline of Christine's death. She was certain she had checked the clock just before heading to the kitchen, which suggested that Paul wouldn't have had enough time to reach their house after work. He needed at least 15 to 20 minutes for that journey. The detectives persisted in questioning the mother, pressing her to reconsider the accuracy of her timeline. Despite their insistence that Paul was the murderer, her account didn't quite align with that theory. Eventually, she admitted that he might have arrived a bit later than she had first believed, providing the police with the leeway they needed to continue. In court, both the prosecution and defense worked to paint Paul as a strange recluse, with his behavior unsettling the other residents of the town. The prosecution contended that Paul could have had ample time to abduct Christine, especially given that his mother arrived home later than she first claimed. To counter the testimony of Paul's relatives, who backed his alibi, the prosecutor introduced a psychologist who asserted that the family exhibited signs of trying to cover for him. A pivotal moment in the trial came when an undercover police officer, who had been placed in the same holding cell as Paul while he awaited trial, testified. The officer revealed that Paul had shared specific details about the crime, including the cause of Christine's death. However, this information was already public, having been reported in the news, which meant it wasn't considered new evidence. Furthermore, Paul frequently mentioned that his favorite movie was The Shining, often responding to questions with quotes from the film. Despite maintaining his innocence, the undercover officer's testimony heavily influenced the trial. The prosecutor's attempts to paint Paul as an exceedingly odd and potentially dangerous individual only further tarnished his image in the eyes of the court. Despite this, the prosecution's questionable evidence ultimately led the court to find it insufficient for a conviction. In the end, Paul was acquitted and released. The tribunal indicated plans to appeal the decision, still suspecting his involvement in the case. Christine's family was devastated once more. They had to continue living just meters away from the man accused of their daughter's murder. Her father expressed that since the day of her death, they had been living in hell, and now that hell would continue. The residents of Queensville were also dissatisfied with the court's ruling, viewing Paul as a murderer and unwilling to have him in their community. Upon his return home, Paul and his family began receiving threatening letters, intensifying tensions within the community. Meanwhile, the country was in an uproar. Critics highlighted that during the initial trial, the judge had not adequately explained the concept of reasonable doubt to the jury, which provided sufficient grounds for the higher court to order a retrial. He started in 1991, just a few years after the murder. During his investigation, he uncovered some intriguing facts. It turned out that the expert who had connected the fabric pieces from Paul's car to Christine's clothing had searched for similar materials. However, by the time of the analysis, much of the evidence, including those fabric pieces and several hairs found on Christine, had vanished. Furthermore, several bones of Christine and a cigarette butt were found alongside her body, but this evidence was missing from the case materials. This raised significant questions, particularly since Paul had never smoked. Despite these complications, the new trial commenced. This time, the main allegation was that Paul had seen the magnetophone in Christine's hands and, intrigued, had picked up a musical instrument to play. The theory suggested that Christine, captivated by the music, approached his car, at which point Paul forced her inside, drove her to an undisclosed location, and ultimately took her life. While this theory was, to be honest, quite flimsy, in July '92, the jury delivered a unanimous verdict. They found Paul guilty of murder, sentencing him to life in prison. However, after the second trial, public perception of the case took a dramatic turn. Initially, the media had painted Paul as a strange and dangerous individual, but as new information about investigative shortcomings emerged, the narrative shifted. Discussions began about Paul possibly being innocent, a victim of significant unprofessionalism. In this climate, a group of supporters formed, dedicated to contesting the court's decision. Under pressure from this movement, Paul filed an appeal which was ultimately granted. He was released from jail on bail, an unusual development, but the considerable social attention surrounding the case made it possible. However, this came with its challenges. The bail amount was set at around $500,000, forcing his parents to mortgage their house to secure such a significant sum. Meanwhile, Paul's lawyer pushed for DNA analysis of the biological material found under the victim's nails, hoping it would yield new evidence for his defense. The experts initially struggled to extract a genetic profile from the evidence. However, in the mid-90s, advancements in forensic science allowed for a reanalysis, which successfully yielded a DNA profile. The results revealed that this DNA did not match Paul's. This revelation sparked a storm of controversy in Canadian society. Paul had spent a year and a half entangled in court proceedings, and his life was shattered by the police's focus on constructing a case against him rather than seeking the real evidence. In January 1995, on the 10th anniversary of Christine's body being discovered, Paul was exonerated of all charges and finally became a free man. He subsequently sued the authorities for $1.2 million, leading to scrutiny of those involved in fabricating evidence against him. This case also prompted significant reforms in the Canadian legal system aimed at preventing such miscarriages of justice in the future. After Paul's release, the investigation into Christine's murder was reignited, with a new team of detectives taking over. Armed with a DNA sample from the actual perpetrator, they began collecting genetic samples from numerous potential suspects. Despite gathering DNA from hundreds of men, none matched the profile. As time went on, the case was transferred to the Department of Unsolved Homicides. In the years that followed, they periodically revisited the investigation, but identifying new suspects proved difficult. A significant challenge was that the original investigative team had not only lost critical evidence, but also failed to conduct a thorough investigation. The new investigative team was determined to explore every lead, as they were convinced of Paul's guilt and had previously overlooked other potential suspects. Meanwhile, Canadian media maintained a strong interest in the case. Following a detailed article published by a major newspaper, journalists received several intriguing tips from the public. Among them were reports naming at least 3 possible suspects, including one individual who claimed that his father had confessed to Christine's murder shortly before passing away. Others pointed to individuals with questionable reputations who had lived in Queensville at the time. Journalists passed this information to the police, but they couldn't establish any connections to the murder. In 2019, 35 years after Christine's murder, the case was reopened and assigned to a new detective. Armed only with a sample of the criminal's DNA, he opted to pursue genetic genealogy to identify the suspect. Since Canada lacked companies specializing in this innovative method, the detective teamed up with a firm in the US and collaborated closely with their leadership to formulate a strategy. Ultimately, the detectives' efforts bore fruit, and experts began searching for relatives of the suspect using publicly available DNA databases. They identified several individuals connected to the DNA sample through distant family ties, but piecing together a comprehensive understanding of their lineage could take up to a year. As the experts sifted through the information on these distant relatives, they were able to significantly narrow the search. In the end, they concluded that the police would need to investigate around 400 individuals to pinpoint the owner of the DNA sample. After gathering this information, the detective reached out to a colleague in Canada with extensive experience in DNA investigations. His colleague agreed to assist, and together they began tracing the genealogy of the identified individuals. To avoid any biases or premature conclusions, the colleague decided not to share specific details with the detective, ensuring he wouldn't inadvertently form assumptions about anyone's potential involvement. For 8 months, they meticulously analyzed various family lines until they focused on one in particular. This lineage traced back to a man born in 1804, prompting experts to examine hundreds of his descendants. By October 2020, their research had narrowed down to a single name emerging as a strong suspect: Calvin Goover. When the detective learned of this name, he found that Goover had never appeared in any case materials or been mentioned in the thousands of tips gathered over the past 3 decades. However, as he dug deeper into the investigation, an unexpected revelation came to light. Goover was actually one of Christine's closest friends. This twist added a chilling layer to the case, prompting the detective to re-evaluate everything he thought he knew about the circumstances surrounding Christine's disappearance. At the time of Christine's murder, Calvin Goover was 28 years old and lived in Queensville with his wife and children. He had a long-standing friendship with Christine's family, even serving as an emergency contact for them. Remarkably, just a few days before Christine vanished, she had visited the Goover family. During that visit, she mentioned to her husband that she would be taking their son to see his father in jail after a dental appointment, but she wouldn't bring their daughter along, citing that she was too young for such a visit. This connection between Goover and Christine added another layer of complexity to the investigation, raising serious questions about the nature of their relationship and his potential involvement in her disappearance. This meant that Goover was aware that Christine would be home alone on the day of her disappearance. Living nearby and being at home himself, it was possible he could have overheard that conversation. Additionally, Christine knew Gouver well, which might explain why she would feel comfortable approaching him or getting into his car, viewing him as a family friend. The detective then questioned why Gouver had not been mentioned in the original case materials, given his close ties to the family. Upon further investigation, he found that the police had spoken to Gouver's wife during the initial inquiry. She claimed she was not home at the time of Christine's disappearance, raising further questions about Gouver's whereabouts and potential involvement in the case. However, she stated that her husband was home taking care of their young children, which the police accepted as a sufficient alibi without questioning Gouver directly. This oversight allowed Gouver the opportunity to commit the crime, and now the detective needed to confirm his guilt. The challenge was that Gouver had vanished voluntarily in 2015 due to serious health issues. The detective required a direct DNA sample from him, but faced uncertainty, as many deaths weren't thoroughly investigated. Even if a body were found, the chances of recovering viable biological samples after 5 years were slim. Fortunately, the detective caught a break. He contacted medical experts who had previously examined Gouver's body and discovered that they had retained 2 blood samples in storage. These samples were sent to the laboratory where specialists extracted DNA and compared it to the profile of the killer. In a breakthrough, they obtained a complete DNA match. This pivotal moment confirmed that Calvin Gouver was indeed the perpetrator of Christine's murder, finally bringing a long-awaited resolution to the case. The killer was ultimately identified as Gouver. Christine's parents were shocked by this revelation. For all those years, they could never have imagined he was responsible for their daughter's murder. They were deeply upset that he had lived his life with his family and children without facing justice for such a heinous act. Gouver's relatives were similarly stunned when the police informed them of his involvement in Christine's disappearance. His wife claimed she had no idea that her husband was connected to such a crime, leaving everyone grappling with the horrifying truth hidden beneath the surface of their seemingly normal lives. Paul, who had been wrongfully imprisoned for nearly 10 years, expressed to journalists that the discovery of the real killer felt hollow to him. Despite being exonerated, many continued to view him with suspicion. He shared that he had lived in constant fear, a shadow that never left him, emphasizing that the case had not only destroyed Christine's life, but had irrevocably impacted his own as well. Share your thoughts on this story in the comments, and if you found it compelling, give this video a thumbs up. Don't forget to subscribe to our Telegram channel for daily updates on the most intriguing criminal news from around the world, uncensored and unfiltered. Thank you for watching.